Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud. This is a Little Blue Book. It happens to be Little Blue Book number 392, and we're going to start it today. And it is titled The Nurnberg Stove, written by Ouida. That's O-U-I-D-A. And here we go. Check, no copyright date as far as I can see. Nope. The Nurnberg Stove by Ouida. Page 1. August lived in a little town called Hall. Hall is a favorite name for several towns in Austria and in Germany. But this one especial little Hall in the upper Innethal is one of the most charming old world places that I know. And August, for his part, did not know any other. It has been the green meadows and the great mountains all about it, and the gray-green glacier-fed water rushes by it. It has paved streets and enchanting little shops that have all latticed panes and iron gratings to them. It has a very grand old Gothic church that has the noblest blendings of light and shadow, and marble tombs of dead knights, and a look of infinite strength and repose, as a church should have. Then there is the Munzie Tower, black and white, rising out of the greenery, and looking down on a long wooden bridge in the broad, rapid river. And there is an old Schloss, which has been made into a guardhouse, with battlements and frescoes and Helletic devices in gold and colors, and a man-at-arms carved in stone standing life-size in his niche and bearing his date, 1530. A little farther on, but close at hand, is a cloister with beautiful marble columns and tombs, and a colossal wood-carved Calvary, and beside that a small and very rich chapel. Indeed, so full is the little town of the undisturbed past, that to walk in it is like opening a missal of the Middle Ages, all emblazoned and illuminated, with saints and warriors, and it is so clean, and so still, and so noble, by reason of its monuments and its historic color, that I marvel much no one has ever cared to sing its praises. The old pious, heroic life of an age, at once more restful and more brave than ours, still leaves its spirit there, and then there is the girdle of the mountains all around. And that alone means strength, peace, and majesty. In this little town a few years ago, August Strela lived with his people in the stone-paved irregular square where the grand church stands. He was a small boy of 9 years at that time, a chubby-faced little man with rosy cheeks, big hazel eyes, and clusters of curls, the brown of ripe nuts. His mother was dead, his father was poor, and there were many mouths at home to feed. In this country, the winters are long and very cold. The whole land lies wrapped in snow for many months, and this night, that he was trotting home with a jug of beer in his numb red hands, was terribly cold and dreary. The good burghers of Hall had shut their double shutters, and the few lamps that were flickering dully behind their quaint old-fashioned iron casings. The mountains indeed were beautiful, all snow-white under the stars that are so big in frost. Hardly any one was astir. A few good souls wending home from vespers, a tired postboy who blew a shrill blast from his tasseled horn, as he pulled up his sledge before a hostelry, and little August hurried his jug of beer to his ragged sheepskin coat. Hugged his jug of beer to his ragged sheepskin coat, where all who were abroad, for the snow fell heavily, and the good folks of Hall go early to their beds, he could not run, or he would have spilled the beer. He was half frozen and a little frightened, but he kept up his courage by saying over and over, just doesn't seem. Nope, there is a page I'm missing. There we go. Turn the page, my friend. There we go. But he kept up his courage by saying over and over again to himself, I shall soon be at home with dear Hirschvogel. Hirschvogel. He went on through the streets, past the stone man-at-arms of the guardhouse, and so into the place where the great church was, and where near it stood his father Karl Strela's house, was a sculptured Bethlehem over the doorway, and the pilgrimage of the three kings painted on its wall. He had been sent on a long errand outside the gates in the afternoon, over the frozen fields and the broad white snow, and had been belated, and had thought he had heard the wolves behind him at every step, and had reached the town in a great state of terror. Thankful with all his little panting heart to see the oil lamp burning under the first house shrine. But he had not forgotten to call for the beer, and he carried it carefully now, though his hands were so numb that he was afraid they would let the jug down every moment. The snow outlined with white every gable and cornice of the beautiful old wooden houses. The moonlight shone on the gilded signs, the lamps, the grapes, the eagles, and all the quaint devices that hung before the doors. Covered lamps burned before the nativities and crucifixions painted on the walls or let into the woodwork. Here and there, where a shutter had not been closed, a ruddy firelight lit up a homely interior, with the noisy band of children clustering round the house mother and a big brown loaf, or some gossip spinning and listening to the cobbler's or the baker's story of a neighbor, while the oil wicks glimmered and the hearth logs blazed and the chestnuts sputtered in their iron roasting pot. Little August saw all these things, and he saw everything with his two big bright eyes that had such curious lights and shadows in them. But he went heedfully on his way for the sake of the beer, which a single slip of the foot would make him spill. At his knock and call, the solid oak door, 4 centuries old, if one, flew open, and the boy darted in with his beer, and shouted with all the force of mirthful lungs, "Oh, dear Hirschvogel! But for the thought of you, I should have died." It was a large, barren room into which he rushed with so much pleasure, and the bricks were bare and uneven. It had a walnut wood press, handsome and very old, a broad deal table, and several wooden stools for all its furniture. But at the top of the chamber, sending out warmth and color together as the lamp shed its rays upon it, was a tower of porcelain, burnished with all the hues of a king's peacock and a queen's jewels, and surmounted with armed figures and shields and flowers of heraldry, and a great golden crown upon the highest summit of all. It was a stove of 1532, and on it were the letters H.R.H., for it was in every portion the handiwork of the great potter of Nurnberg, Augustin Hirschvogel, who put his mark thus, as all the world knows. The stove, no doubt, had stood in palaces and had been for princes, but warmed the crimson stockings of cardinals and the gold-broidered shoes of archduchesses, had glowed in presence chambers and led its carbon to help kindle sharp brains in anxious councils of state. No one knew what it had seen or done or been fashioned for, but it was a right royal thing. Yet, perhaps, it had never been more useful than it was now, and in this poor desolate room, sending down heat and comfort into the troop of children tumbled together on a wolf skin at its feet, who received frozen August among them with loud shouts of joy. "Oh, dear Hirschvogel, I am so cold, said August, kissing its girdled lion's claws. Its father not in. Dorothea? No, dear, he is late. Oh, is father not in? Dorothea? No, dear, he is late. Dorothea was a girl of 17, dark-haired and serious, and with a sweet, sad face, for she had had many cares laid on her shoulders, even whilst still a mere baby. She was the eldest of the Strela family, and there were 10 of them in all. Next to her there came Jan and Karl and Otho, big lads, gaining a little for their own living. And then came August, who went up in the summer to the high Alps with the farmer's cattle, but in winter could do no thing to fill his own little platter and pot. And then all the little ones, who could only open their mouths to be fed like young birds. Albert and Hilda and Waldo and Christoph, and, last of all, little 3-year-old Ermengelda, with eyes like forget-me-nots, whose birth had cost them the life of their mother. They were of that mixed race, half Austrian, half Italian, so common in the Tyrol. Some of the children were white and golden as lilies. Others were brown and brilliant as fresh fallen chestnuts. The father was a good man, but weak and weary with so many to find for and so little to do it with. He worked at the salt furnaces and by that gained a few florins. People said he would have worked better and kept his family more easily if he had not loved his pipe and a little draught of ale too well. But this had only been said of him after his wife's death, when trouble and perplexity had begun to dull a brain never too vigorous, and to enfeeble further a character already too yielding. As it was, the wolf often bayed at the door of the Strela household, without a wolf from the mountains coming down. Dorothea was one of those maidens who almost work miracles. So far can their industry and care and intelligence make a home sweet and wholesome, and a single loaf seem to swell into 20. The children were always clean and happy, and the table was seldom without its big pot of soup once a day. Still very poor they were, and Dorothea's heart ached with shame, for she knew that their father's debts were many, for flour and meat and clothing. Of fuel to feed the big stove they had always enough without cost, for their mother's father was alive, and sold wood and fir cones and coke, and never grudged them to his grandchildren, though he grumbled at Strela's improvidence and hapless, dreamy ways. And we'll pause there for Chapter 2. Okay, we're back. Chapter 2. Father says we are never to wait for him. We will have supper. Now you have come home. Now that you have come home, dear, said Dorothea, who, however she might fret her soul in secret as she knitted their hose and mended their shirts, never let her anxieties cast a gloom on the children. Only to August she did speak a little sometimes, because he was so thoughtful and so tender of her always, and knew as well as she did that there were troubles about money. Though these troubles were vague to them both, and the debtors were patient and kindly, being neighbors all in the old twisting streets between the guardhouse and the river. Supper was a huge bowl of soup with big slices of brown bread swimming in it, and some onions bobbing up and down. The bowl was soon emptied by 10 wooden spoons, and then the 3 eldest boys slipped off to bed. Being tired with their rough bodily labor of the snow all day. Tired with her rough bodily labor in the snow all day, and Dorothea drew her spinning wheel by the stove and set it whirling. And the little ones got August down upon the old worn wolfskin and clamored to him for a picture or a story, for August was the artist of the family. He had a piece of planed deal that his father had given him, and some sticks of charcoal, and he would draw 100 things he had seen in a day, sweeping each out with his elbow when the children had seen enough of it, and sketching another in its stead. Faces and dogs, heads and men and sledges, and old women in their furs, and pine trees, and cocks and hens, and all sorts of animals, and now and then, very reverently, a Madonna and child. It was all very rough, for there were no one to teach him anything, but it was all lifelike and kept the whole troop of children shrieking with laughter or watching breathless with a wide open, wondering, awed eyes. They were all so happy. Did they care for the snow outside? Their little bodies were warm and their hearts merry. Even Dorothea, troubled about the bread for the morrow, laughed as she spun, and August, with all his soul in his work, and little Rosie Ermagilda's cheek on his shoulder, glowing after his frozen afternoon, cried out loud, smiling as he looked up at the stove that was shedding its heat down on them all. "Oh, dear Hirschvogel, you are almost as great and good as the sun. No, you are greater and better, I think, because he goes away. Nobody knows where all these long, dark, cold hours, and does not care how people die for want of him. But you are always ready. Just a little bit of wood to feed you, and you will make a summer for us all the winter through." The grand old stove seemed to smile, though all its iridescent surfaces, at the praises of the child. No doubt the stove, though it had known 3 centuries and more, had known but very little gratitude. It was one of these magnificent stoves, an enameled faience, which so excited the jealousy of the other potters of Nurnberg that in a body they demanded of the magistracy that Augustin Hirschvogel should be forbidden to make any more of them. The magistracy, happily, proving of a broader mind. Is that proving? Yeah, proving of a broader mind, and having no sympathy with the wish of the artisans to cripple their greater fellow. It was of great height and breadth, with all the majolica luster which Hirschvogel learned to give to his enamels when he was making love to the young Venetian girl whom he afterwards married. There was the statue of a king at each corner, modelled with as much force and splendor as his friend Albert Dürer could have given unto them in copper plate or canvas. The body of the stove itself was divided into panels, which had the ages of men painted on them in polychrome. The borders of the panels had roses and holly and laurel, and other foliage, and German mottos in black letter of odd old world, moralizing, such as the old Teutons and the Dutch after them loved to have on their chimney places and their drinking cups, their dishes and flagons. The whole was burnished with the gilding in many parts, and was radiant everywhere with the brilliant coloring of which the Hirschvogel family, painters on glass and great in chemistry as they were all masters. The stove was a very grand thing, as I say. Possibly Hirschvogel had made it for some mighty lord of the Tyrol at the time when he had an imperial guest at Innsbruck, and fashioned so many things for the Shyloss, Amries, and beautiful Philippine Welser, the burgher's daughter, who gained an archduke's heart by her beauty, and the right to wear his honors by her wit. Nothing was known of the stove in this latter day in Hall. The grandfather Strela, who had been a master mason, had dug it up out of some ruins where he was building, and finding it without a flaw, had taken it home, and only thought it worth finding because it was such a good one to burn. That was now 60 years past, and ever since then the stove had stood in the big, desolate, empty room, warming 3 generations of the Strela family, and having seen nothing prettier, perhaps in all its many years, than the children tumbled now in a cluster like Gethrel flowers at its feet. From the Strela children, born to nothing else, were all born with beauty, white or brown. They were equally lovely to look upon, and when they went into the church to mass, with their curling locks and their clasped hands, they stood under the grim statues like cherubs flown down off some fresco. "Tell us a story," Auguste cried. In chorus, "Tell us a story," Auguste cried in chorus, when they had seen charcoal pictures till they were tired, and Auguste did as he did every night pretty nearly, looked up at the stove and told them what he imagined of the many adventures and joys and sorrows of the human being who figured on the panels from his cradle to his grave. To the children, this stove was a household god. In summer, they laid a mat of fresh moss all around it, and dressed it up in green boughs and the numberless beautiful wild flowers of the Tyrol country. In winter, all their joys centered in it, and scampering home from school over the ice and snow, they were happy, knowing that they would soon be crackling nuts or roasting chestnuts in the broad, ardent glow of its noble tower, which rose 8 feet high above them with all its spires and pinnacles and crowns. Once a traveling peddler had told them that the letters on it meant Augustin Hirschvogel, and that Hirschvogel had been a great German potter and painter, like his father before him, in the art-sanctified city of Nurnberg, and had made many, many such stoves that were all miracles of beauty and workmanship, putting all his heart and his soul and his faith into his labors, as the men of those earlier ages did, and thinking but little of gold or praise. And an old trader, too, who sold curiosities not far from the church, had told August a little more about the brave family of Hirschvogel, whose houses can be seen in Nuremberg to this day, of old Veit, the first of them, who painted the Gothic windows of St. Sebald, and the marriage of the Margravine, of his son and of his grandsons, potters, painters, and gravers all, and chief of them great Augustin, the Luca della Robbia of the north. And August's imagination, always quick, had made a living person out of these few records, and saw Hirschvogel as though he were in the flesh, walking up and down the Maximilianstrasse in his visit to Innsbruck, and maturing beautiful things in his brain as he stood on the bridge and gazed on the emerald-green flood of the inn. So the stove had got to be called Hirschvogel in the family, as if it were a living creature, and little August was very proud because he had been named after the famous old dead turn the page. Old dead German who had the genius to make so glorious a thing. All the children loved the stove, but with August the love of it was a passion, and in his heart, and in his secret heart, he used to say to himself, "When I am a man, I will make just such things too, and then I will set Hirschvogel in a beautiful room in a house that I will build myself in Innsbruck, just outside the gates, where the chestnuts are by the river. That is what I will do when I am a man." And I think we'll stop there for the first chapter of, or not first chapter, for the first part of the Nurnberg Stove, book number 392 of the Little Blue Book series written by Ouida. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in part 2.